Hello, good afternoon all. My name is Andrea Woodside and I'm from Retail Trust. Retail Trust was actually founded by a gentleman of the name Thomas Helps back in 1832. And I find it quite striking that nearly 200 years later, we're still in a situation where inequalities exist in the retail sector. And so part of our work is to ensure that people actually find equality, find a voice, and find well-being. So our tag, if you will, is health, hope, and happiness. Now, we all know where retail has been struggling for the last 190 years, probably more, but certainly since the advent of COVID. And one of the things we've noticed is people who are working in retail and coming at it from a manager's point of view, they're tired. They're really, really tired. And one of the things I think about owning a store or being a line manager or having some kind of responsibility for other people, it makes life quite complex. And where it becomes very complex is when we ourselves are exhausted, but we're spending an enormous amount of time every single day having conversations about other people's lives and trying desperately to give advice and to make it all better. And one of the things, of course, in retail is that we're really good at fixing problems, right? We're really amazing at fixing problems. The pallet goes missing, customer falls down in the middle of the store, something happens, we fix it. But the reality is we may be the most compassionate, empathetic people on the planet, but we can't fix other people's issues. So this session is really introducing you to a model called Flight School. And Flight School distills the concept of having a great well-being conversation into really, really simple steps. So what it does is it gives you a sense of control even before you go into the conversation. I think one of the things that I hear a lot, of course, from retailers is, you know, I get in there with all the will in the world and I'm sitting down and suddenly I realize they're saying something to me and I'm completely out of my depth. This concept, this model, will help you to actually stay the course. And I would argue, for anybody watching this, don't forget too that this is stuff you can take back outside of work into your social life, your family life, and other areas of your life where you may be called upon to support other people. So we developed the model in reaction to an understanding that there were a lot of people going into well-being conversations in the workplace and suddenly very quickly feeling out of their depth. And when we feel out of our depth, what we tend to do is we overcompensate. So we kind of might think, okay, gosh, I've really got to fix this person's problem. Well, the reality is that you can't bring somebody's partner back. You can't make sure that their child is attending school. You can't pay their mortgage. When I talk about something called the accidental counselor, I think it's quite a powerful thing to remember. A lot of us do become accidental counselors. I remember 10 years ago, I was at a retail trust event. Okay? And there were all sorts of people there. And I knew that anybody who was attending this event as retailers would have access to our services. And I went into the ladies' room and I came across a woman who was incredibly distraught. And I went up to her and I said, "How are you? What can I do? How can I help you?" And she told me a very complex story because here's the rub, man. Because we're human, we're complex, so our stories are complex every single time. This ain't a 2-minute conversation. And she told me this story, multi-layered, complex, sad, rich, and really distressing. And I said, I wonder if you might consider speaking to a counselor, somebody maybe at Retail Trust who can help you to think through some of the challenges that you're facing. You know, our motto is very much, a problem shared is a problem halved. And I'll never forget this. I remember exactly what I was wearing, what she was wearing. I remember this so clearly. And she looked me straight in the eye and she said, "Oh, no, I don't need a counselor. My manager does that." And I'm kind of like, part of me is like, well, how's that going for you? Because clearly it's not going so well. To this day, years later, I'm sure there is still that manager clutching a bottle of gin, weeping silently in a corner, saying, "Make it stop." When we attempt to counsel other people, we will inevitably get it wrong. And it's not because we're not smart, it's not because we don't care, it's not because we're not good people, it's because we're not counselors. And actually, here's something, I don't know if you know this, a counselor, like a clinician, will not tell you what to do. So I don't know why we kind of blur those lines. Now, this message, I think, can come across as quite dispassionate, as if I'm saying, you come across somebody, they're having a really difficult time in their life, things are falling apart, things are absolutely awful, and quite frankly, you just go in, pat them on the head and say, "It'll be all right then." That's not what we're saying. What we are saying is with the right planning, you will make more of a difference in less time than you can imagine. You will make more of a difference in less time than you can imagine. So the flight concept, we at Retail Trust like the idea of a flight because any well-being conversation is a journey. And this might be with your neighbor, it could be with your friend, it could be with your colleague, it could be with somebody, line manager, it could be with somebody in the street. But structure actually adds clarity. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. This isn't so structured that we're suggesting you do 1, 2, 3 in a really binary way. We're suggesting actually structure provides clarity. So pre-flight, what we mean by pre-flight is the stuff that you do before the conversation while your fellow passenger, your colleague, your friend, your neighbor isn't there. So they're not in the room with you. This is the time at which you start to think about, what do I need to have a great well-being conversation? So one of the things I find really interesting is people will have well-being conversations when they're struggling themselves. There's no heroism in that. There's nothing heroic about you being on your knees, exhausted and feeling fragile, and saying, "Oh, I know what I'll do. I'll now spend X amount of time with somebody who's in a lot of pain." The point here is that we have to be honest with ourselves and we have to be honest with others. So this isn't about saying to somebody, "Look, I'm going to tell you my life story, and this is what's going on for me at this point, and my life is falling apart, therefore I can't talk to you." This is actually just very simple, saying, you know what I think would be really helpful for both of us is if we can arrange a time where we're both in the right space to do it. Because I don't want to undermine your story. I don't want to not be present because I've got my own stuff going on. Okay. And I've never heard, after giving that piece of advice, as it were, although it's not really advice, I guess it's a bit of an insight, I've never heard somebody come back and say, "Oh, you're a terrible person, how dare you, that's an awful thing to do to me." People just don't do that. So it's about being honest. Right, you wouldn't run a marathon when you've sprained your leg, right? So why would you have a well-being conversation when you're in psychic pain yourself? There's no heroism in that. You're free to speak without distractions. This is really interesting. I find this so fascinating. We are so attached to our phone. We are so attached to our technology. We're so attached to having something in our head or in our hands at all times. And you could argue, a lot of people are saying it's because, phone addiction. I think it's because it's almost like a soothing thing for us. A phone can soothe us. It's less about what we're seeing on the phone, maybe a bit more about having some kind of soothing thing. We got to find another way to do that, because if you're having a conversation with somebody, you've got your phone in your hand, do not have the conversation. Do not have that conversation, ever. I promise. It'd be ridiculous. Can you imagine that? So the message that you're sending is actually, I'm super nervous. I don't really know how to handle this conversation, so I'm just going to hang on to my phone. The other thing I would suggest is what's really good is to not just say, oh, I'm just going to turn my phone over so we can't see it. One of the most powerful things you can do for another human being, whether you know them well or not, and I promise you it's so powerful, it's incredibly powerful, is as you start to agree that you're going to sit down and have that conversation, you show them your phone as you switch it off. And you say, you know what, you're much more important than my phone. So not only am I going to put it away, but I'm going to turn it off. Easy. Easy. It goes without saying, urgent tasks. So one of the things I hear a lot in retailers, and this might be, a store with 200 people, it could be a store with one person, it doesn't matter. But what I find very interesting is we all tend to want to react in the moment. So somebody comes to you at, 10 o'clock in the morning, and you've got to be in a meeting at 10:15. So right now you're already under the gun. And yet what we tend to do is we think, well, just expedite the conversation. Maybe I can make it go really fast, right? Which isn't doing anybody any favors. Or maybe what I'll do is I'll just kind of be late for that meeting because this takes precedence. Here's our suggestion to you. Make them wait. And that sounds kind of mean, but I'll tell you something. When we say to somebody in their eyes, you know what, this really matters to me, and I want to be fully present for you. I've got a meeting in 15 minutes. I'll be finished at 11. Or I've got a phone call that I need to return. Or I've got to chase up an order right now. Why don't you and I meet at X place at X time? That will do a few things. It will calm you, okay, so you're not going into it, you're not going to be freaking out. But critically, it will also give the other person the opportunity to reflect and to calm down themselves so that the conversation will be much more powerful than if you did it off the hoof. Now, clearly, if somebody is in front of you and you're concerned for their safety and you're worried and they're very, very distraught and they're sobbing and things are really... We're not suggesting you make them wait, but on a day-to-day basis, when those conversations come up, it's usually they're kind of coming to you as they think about it, but stay in control of that, okay? And also, for those of you guys with colleagues in your stores, what I think is also very powerful is we start to send a message to other people in the store to say, you know what, one person doesn't take precedence over the other. So this is all about equal time and equal effort. A lot of people also forget the idea of access to private space, which I find kind of interesting. And I can usually tell what the culture of a store is like if I'm in store and I'm seeing an emotionally charged conversation going on between a store manager and a colleague. And that can be because they're just so used to sort of, hanging out in the aisle and having a chat about something very personal. But it's just mindful, obviously, for those of us in retail, it's really important to delineate our private space from our public space. Now, this is where this kind of gets interesting, right? So I'm saying, before you go in, you have a sense of where to signpost. And that can be easier if you understand some of the issues that particular colleague is facing. But if you don't, you can still have something in the back pocket. So there's two things here that I think can be helpful. If somebody is telling you that they're struggling, say, for example, with their mental health, maybe they have a mental health condition or they suspect they do, or things are really difficult for them. It's very tempting to say to somebody, oh, well, yeah, definitely you should go and see the GP. Of course you could. Yeah, of course you would. Don't be silly. When we tell somebody to go and see the GP, it can feel incredibly paternalistic. So the question you want to ask instead is, does your GP know how you're feeling? That's an incredibly powerful question, because you're not giving them direction, you're saying, I want to know a little bit more. And that's also the point at which you'll understand what their barriers to not seeing the GP are. Don't forget, you're not there to diagnose. That's good news, right? That's good news. I don't know whether you know this, there's over 560 distinct mental health conditions with which a human being can be diagnosed. So the last thing we want you guys to do is be running around with your clipboard and your questionnaires and diagnosing people. That's the sole purview of a clinician such as a GP or other form of stepped up care. Or you might have signposting which is really general. So it could be a local charity, a charity that you know can support people with a variety of issues. So that might be a local charity that supports people with debt, or somebody who is in your community who supports people through relationship breakdown. I also want to highlight too, as members of Hive, you have access to our Wellbeing content. So you would go on to retailtrust.org.uk and you would choose Hive Group and just register. Takes just a minute, and you'll have access to a huge amount of information around all aspects of health and well-being. The point about signposting is what we're essentially encouraging people to do is to approach their own issues responsibly. And it's not about saying you should phone Relate, you should phone so-and-so, you should phone so-and-so. It's about saying, what could your life look like if you sat down and talked to somebody who's specialist in your area of need? It's about painting that picture of what could be versus where you are now. We can't force anybody to accept or seek help. That's not possible. But we can do our level best. I refer often to the concept of a lighthouse. So a lighthouse stands proud of the water. It's not in the ocean. If it were in the ocean, it would topple over, it would wash away. What's interesting is that the lighthouse stands above the water and it shines a light to those people who are struggling to say, this is your passage of safety. This is how to get from here to there safely. As managers in retail, that's our job. We don't get in the ocean with the person who is drowning. We don't swim out to meet them. We stand proud and firm on terra firma, shining a light towards where to get support. And that's the whole point. You know you've got it wrong when you're swimming out to sea with them and then you both drown. Just make sure that you've had something to drink, something to eat. Just make sure that your body is going to behave, cooperate. Go to the ladies or gents if you need to before the meeting. Just make sure that you've got everything watertight. And don't forget tissues. I carry tissues with me all the time. I've got 2 in my handbag over there. I saw a woman on the train this morning crying. Boy, that's really cool. You don't have to run around finding tissue. Always carry tissues with you. Because, by the way, there's a lot of people around you who are crying on a daily basis and you don't notice it. If you're taking the train home tonight, you'll see it. Always carry tissues. Always carry tissues. So now we're actually now heading towards the conversation and we're in flight. So in flight, of course, what I mean by that is around, this is the conversation, man. And this is where the pre-flight stuff is going to pay off. So you're going to go in there feeling confident. Now, you might be in flight after going up to a colleague to say, I noticed that you've been struggling. How can I help you? Why don't you and I meet in an hour and have a chat? Or somebody might be coming to you. So whether you're approaching them or they're approaching you, it doesn't matter. In-flight is always the same, but in-flight is much smoother, less turbulent with the pre-flight work done. Okay, so I mean this is, pretty basic the room temperature is comfortable, your mobile phone is switched off. They've got access to a drink. They've been able to visit the ladies or gents before the meeting if they need to. Now, the who, what, why, where, when, and how questions are great, and I think we all learned those when we were kids, right? Like, you remember the who, what, why, where, when, and how. And the question you never want to ask when you're supporting somebody in an emotional context is why. Asking why can sound incredibly judgmental. Well, why do you feel that way? Why did he leave you? Why is your kid failing school? The why can actually stop and put a barrier and can actually shut conversations down. So who, what, where, when, and how, kosher, but avoid the why. I don't know how many of us in this room also suffer from the very common need to finish other people's sentences. Does anybody do that? So we anticipate, because we're all allegedly psychic. So I'm sitting, I've known you for 10 seconds, and you're telling me a story. And I know 10 seconds in exactly your whole life history. And I know what you should do. And I know how you should do it. And I know. Wow, that's where we miss the magic, right? Because we're so involved in our own internal story. Our own internal story interrupts other people's stories. And it's not cool. It's not all right. So when we think about wanting to interrupt people, consider WAIT. WAIT stands for why am I talking? It's beautiful. So when you have that urge and you go, but I want to get this thing in because I know everything, you can actually just put your tongue behind your front teeth, rest it there gently, and say to yourself, wait, why am I talking? We often talk to fill silence, and the only person that benefits is you. It does nothing for them. Don't share your own experiences, please. To share is to compare. To share is to compare. Somebody says, you know, I had a really bad divorce a few years ago. It was absolutely brutal. And it's our human instinct to go, your divorce was bad? Mine was hideous, man. I lost everything. He ran off with a neighbor. Your story will always be more dramatic to you than anybody else's. Trust me on that one. It's just human, man. It's human. It's all right. It's cool. But your story actually doesn't matter. It does not matter at all. The other reason we tend to tell our own story is to try from a really kind and loving and empathetic point of view to make that person feel better. But it has the opposite effect. To share is to compare. Giving advice is also really not a good idea. Giving advice. So if you say to somebody, well, you know what? I don't know, I'm going to make this up on the spot. Your ex is calling and they want to get back together, but you've told me that that person has been really horrible to you. I wouldn't do it. Definitely don't do it. Definitely don't do it. When they do get back together, that's going to put you in a tricky position. So giving advice is never a good idea. Never works. Give yourself advice. Give yourself advice. Now, my rule of thumb when giving advice is I look at the person in front of me who's asking me for advice, and I ask myself, have I given birth to this person? And if the answer is no, I have not given birth to this person, I don't give advice. And if I were a bloke, I might say, was I involved in the process with which this person came to this planet? If the answer is no, I don't give advice. Give advice to your kids. Knock yourself out. Fill your boots. All good. But don't give advice to anybody else. Because your advice is coming from your own lived experience, and your lived experience is very different from theirs. Ask what they need from you. I think our human kind of nature is when we're presented with somebody who's struggling, what we tend to do is we'll say, how can I help you? And rarely do we actually step back and think, what do you need from me? And what they need from you may be vastly different than what you think you can give them. The reality is sometimes people just actually want to vent. Some people just want to chat. Some people just want to cry. Some people just want to be heard. You don't have to fix it. And let them know that you'll check in with them again. This is a really important thing, and I think something that we often miss. So we'll say, we've just had this great well-being conversation for half an hour. It's been fantastic. I've done all this great work. And then they drop off the radar. They just drop off the radar. We need to commit. We absolutely need to commit to knowing that, arrival, meaning we've landed, that has to be picked up. If we just forget about that person, we're not going to appear terribly credible. And finally, arrival. Now, the reason we've delineated this is because what we don't want people doing is having the same well-being conversation with the same person again and again and again and again. So if you find that you're having to have a well-being conversation pretty much about the same thing day after day after day after day after day, right? You're missing something. Something has been missed. And I would argue that that's because we're allowing that to happen. We need to be brave and clear. And actually, I can't fix you. One of the best things you can say to someone when they say, but you're the only person who understands. You really get me. This is amazing. You're such a good listener. I can sit here every hour, every day from 4 to 4:30 and have a tea and, tell you all my problems. Think of that woman I spoke to that at the top of the session. There is somebody in Leeds clutching a bottle of gin, rocking back and forth, silently weeping, saying, make this stop. Do not be that person. Best thing you can say when you find yourself in that trap, because my friends, it is a trap, is to say something very clearly like, you know what? I don't want to deny you the opportunity of having amazing support from someone who knows what they're doing. And if you need to say, I don't want to deny, if you need to say that 30 times, say it 30 times, right? So, you're going to diarize. You're going to follow up when you say you're going to follow up. In our experience, we think that 3 and 5 days is absolutely appropriate. Too soon, not great. It feels pushy. And then if you let it go too long, then we haven't necessarily told them that they matter. Even if they do to us, leaving it that long can feel as though they've been abandoned sometimes for people. And the conversation, has it been challenging to you? Well, I'll tell you, as somebody who has these conversations all the time, I regularly reach out for help to, might be a peer, it could be a colleague, it could be a clinician, it could be somebody where I'm saying, you know what, I've had a really, really intense conversation today, and that was really hard. And I don't want to take this into my weekend. I don't want to take this to bed tonight. I don't want to take this into my meeting that I've got in half an hour. There's no shame in actually having that conversation with somebody else. That's a very important thing. As part of self-care, there is no heroism in being the repository for terrible, dreadful, awful stories and thinking it doesn't touch you, because it doesn't work like that. And finally, know that you've made a difference. I bet if you think back to a time when you have felt truly listened to, you have felt that that person across from you is truly, truly present. You remember those. You remember those moments. Now, they may not, but when you've been really listened to, you know that they've made a difference. So all that we're saying here is be the difference you want to see. Again, a reminder, retailtrust.org.uk. Just choose Hive Group. You can sign up. It's all GDPR compliant. We're not going to hunt you down. We're not going to hassle you or mither you. with information you don't want, but it's a really useful and effective way to get as much information as you can to be able to make the choices that will benefit you. So thank you very much.